Hello everyone and welcome to the Healthtech Pigeon podcast, brought to you by the team at SomX, where we analyse the best stories of the week every single week. I'm Huw and today I'm joined by SomX's very own Belle Taylor. We're looking forward to running through what I think is some very interesting stories, and I hope you all agree. So I guess let's get started. Belle, how's your week been?
It's been good, apart from just being told off from Huw by being too smiley on a Friday. But other than that, I'm holding on. It's been super busy, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, ahead of a bank holiday, but lots of exciting things underway.
It's hard enough to keep it together on these podcasts, as our poor unfortunate editor, Jared, will know how often we have to re-record things. But
you cannot prove, no one can prove that, Huw. So that's the main thing. What we record, we're perfect first time.
What can I say? We're very transparent on Pigeon Podcast. You don't always get things right first time, do you? Wonderful. Yeah. So we've got a lot to talk about this week. Lots of confessions from investors, lots of exciting ideas to fix the NHS. And obviously we had an election announced in the UK earlier this week. So we'll see how many of those ideas. I think it's going to be a key battleground. Who's going to be first to lay claim to many of these ideas on the way? So our first story comes to us from, BT's own website, actually, which is no surprise because BT have obviously in the last 6 months to a year, at least kicked off quite an effort in the healthcare space, and particularly in the digital health space, using their health offering to support the NHS and other tech companies to scale innovative solutions. So let's see what they bring us today, which is an article, 5 Ways to Unlock a Digital Health Revolution in the NHS. So this story is essentially a write-up of a roundtable by fairly well-regarded healthcare expert, Professor Sultan Mahmood, Director of Healthcare at BT. And this roundtable had a wonderful set of really cool people working in healthcare, hosted by BT, and a roundtable organised by the King's Fund, looking at what's standing in the way of a digital health revolution in the NHS. Obviously, it talks about the amazing work over the last 75 years that the NHS has helped bring forward, but we're obviously under high structural pressures, funding issues, and higher demand, and there's a potential for a huge amount of benefit that we can bring using innovation. The question, of course, is what's standing in the way of health innovation in the NHS? And true to the title, it has 5 suggestions. The first is a lack of incentives for innovation. And this isn't just funding, this isn't just putting in the money to actually make it happen. It's the responsibility for finding, proposing, testing and championing new technology all too often falls on clinical staff who probably hasn't escaped your or their attention, don't have a lot of time to do that. A fragmented NHS structure, 42 ICSs, 200 trusts, wide range of different services. Short-termism, which I don't have to explain. There's it's hard to think more than 3 weeks in advance sometimes. So the idea of actually looking at a 5-year plan to bring in innovation is obviously quite hard. Patient journeys are not ready to be digitized. I think we'll come back to this one as well because it's really interesting. I think one of the bigger barriers that's possibly less often talked about. And the final one is a lack of trust in tech. Obviously, this is one that reaches far beyond just clinicians. We've seen surveys of hospital execs, clinicians, patients, the public, about whether they trust different technology. And, whether you're looking at something like the Federated Data Platform, whether you're looking at AI being used in clinical consultations, or you're looking at something more widely about the use of AI in diagnoses and its role in the patient journey. There's obviously a number of places where, trust is key. And if we don't overcome that, we're going to have a real problem. So 5 big barriers. The article has some really interesting suggestions of how we can overcome these, but, we can come to those as we come. Belle, what are your thoughts on these?
One of the things in general that I love about this is it's an article on the BT website, my favourite healthcare publisher, editorial platform. But no, I think it's really interesting that we've got these big companies like BT who you wouldn't think are working and doing so much in the healthcare space, having an interest in these conversations. And obviously they mentioned that they've been working alongside the NHS for a long time. And that makes sense if you actually think of what they are in terms of providers. And it opens a wider conversation to all these other businesses that link into the NHS in sort of other service capacities that you might think don't have a view, but they should, because AI and technology and digital health is going to touch them in ways that they maybe couldn't have foreseen. That's an odd sentence, touch them in ways, but we are. So yeah, I think really great that BT, NHS, the BBC were all able to get together and have this conversation. Like you say, lots of these barriers or standing points, they're nothing particularly new or novel. And the 5-point plan that they've put together off the back of this is maybe not the most groundbreaking 5-point plan that anyone would have come across. We can run through them shortly now, but I think a really, really great starting step. So I'm just going to quickly just do the 5 points just so that we can just get them out there, and then we can just sort of discuss what this might mean more generally. So firstly, they mentioned that one of the ways that technology can help kind of provide solutions and unlock this digital health revolution is by building platforms to scale. So I think that's the really important thing here, is that scalability is a word that you find coming up a lot in anything kind of digital health, because it's all well and good having a solution, but if that can't scale across multiple trusts across the world, then what solution is it really? The second is to modernize data infrastructure. So that's here they're suggesting that is through mandated contracts with technology providers to ensure that we're kind of implementing solutions that are specific to people's needs, and also encouraging interoperability and communication between other trusts. That's somewhat linked to the one above, like scale and interoperability. I feel they come together as a pair, because what's one without the other? The third is, I think, the most interesting point on this list, which is national leadership and local delivery. And this links in with us talking about elections and all sorts. But I think the idea that we have decisions made at a national level are great, but particularly in the healthcare space, particularly where people go to their GPs or primary care provider as, that's the relationship that they have with their healthcare that is the most long-standing. I think it's really important that we see that local delivery of things so that we can actually get insight into what people need on a regional level, rather than just this is what feels good for the country as a whole. So yeah, they're suggesting here that they're moving certain roles responsible for designing governance frameworks to the front line of the revolution by implementing and leveraging vanguards across trusts to allow those that have been successful in their regions to help support adoption across other regions. So probably showcasing loads of really successful case studies. And this is really interesting for digital health companies as well, who often, they find themselves selling into trusts individually. And so it really, really supports them when they know that they can build up that framework and that evidence base of success and then roll that out across the country as a result. So I think that's the most exciting one. I'll just quickly say the last two and then throw that back to you, Huw, because I think you've probably got thoughts on these. But number 4 is better communication. That goes without saying. And then 5 is shifting mindsets to move faster, which is a slightly intriguing one, because I'm not sure anyone is intentionally moving slowly. But I think what they're saying here is that in the pandemic, things had to move faster, so they did. And we're starting to see a rollback to, we don't have to do everything as quickly as we did then, but maybe it's advantageous sometimes to have a little bit of fire in order to get things done. So yeah, what do you think, Huw? I'm sure that when it comes to change at scale, these things are slow, we know that, but do you think that goes far enough, or do you think that is a bit too broad, generic and predictable?
It's a good question, and one I think there's a lot of floating parts on this, really, isn't there? Because the ideas are inherently sensible ones. You do want to make sure that the options to scale are, and a lot of the national leadership, local delivery piece is critical. But What that looks like in practice is quite hard to do. How far do you devolve certain governance frameworks down? How locally, if you're doing things very locally and you're doing these governance frameworks at the local level, does that actually make the scaling across trusts, which all have their own local approach, actually a little bit harder? The shift mindsets to move faster piece is a very interesting one, because it's looking at how quickly trusts can respond to crisis and enact change, reflecting on the key learnings and success stories from the COVID-19 response, carry on proactive can-do attitude. That in itself raises something like a major issue that trusts and healthcare globally is struggling to take over, which is the goodwill piece. There was a really interesting article. It's not in this week's Healthtech Pigeon because it's not tech related, but I think there's a lot of relevance to it here, which is part of the productivity drop since COVID is because lots of NHS staff have burnt through the goodwill of extra stuff that they would be doing, that they were doing in 2019, that the COVID pandemic it forced people to do. But now they're burnt out and they're not seeing the support that they need, but perhaps they're not perceiving the support they need from the centre that would, I guess, prompt the goodwill to bring in the productivity needed to shift these mindsets to the can-do attitude. We do need to shift mindsets in the NHS. It is important, but we're only going to do that if people feel supported to do so, that they feel like there is investment in them, whether that's money, whether that's time, whether that's support, whether that's, I guess, not having to feel like, if you as a senior NHS employee feel like you've just spent 6 months trying to get the pay rise that you needed, you're probably not feeling a huge amount of goodwill because you've invested a lot of time in doing your job well and trying to work for that. So it's a great set of recommendations. It really is. And some of it does feel obvious because we've heard a lot of it before. They're all absolutely the things that we need to address in order to drive innovation in the NHS, create these opportunities, find opportunities for the best examples of innovation to scale. How do we see a pilot and turn it into something that is long term? How do we see something that's long term in one trust and turn it into long term, and so that more patients in a wider geographical area can experience that? And I think a lot of this would go somewhere. It's like every plan, though, isn't it? It's like, whether it's something that Rishi Sunak put out in his 5 priorities, or the Labour Party have put out on their 5 missions that they will do. They're all things that they want to do. And it's an NHS thing that you can put out at the central level, and, you can do it. Probably, every company, every business, every organisation, every charity will put out the 5 things it wants to achieve in a big flashy statement of saying, let's do this, because this will address that. What is then often missing is how do we do the things that we need to do the things that we need to do? And that's the key part of any strategy, which is, great, these are the things we need to make happen. This is exactly what will change: the money, the investment, the time, the funding, the opportunities to collaborate, the co-collaboration forums, anything like that is needed to actually drive something forward. I think in a rare position, BT is actually in a great opportunity here, and this will stop being a BT advert on your Healthtech Pigeon podcast very soon.
Other broadband providers are available.
Exactly. Other telcos are there. We're not pushing anyone above. It's just a great article. But it's what you were talking about, Belle. It's those larger corporate providers who can work and help and play that role in identifying and partnering with smaller startups with great value propositions, with great examples of pilots, and help build that help build and make sure that the infrastructure is there in certain places to make this happen. It's not going to address each and every one of these points. So that's my, I guess, polemic on health innovation in the NHS. I did want to touch on just a couple of those 5 barriers pieces, because again, most of them are very obvious. I think they're obvious because everyone agrees on them. We need to address each and every one of them. I want to look at the one that I think possibly the answer's a bit less easy, which is the patient journeys are not ready to be digitized. this is something I've, been having interesting discussions with quite a range of experts, some in the NHS, some out of the NHS recently, which is that a lot of health innovation opportunities, particularly those big pilots, those big, technology partnerships where a small provider comes in and they show, we can prove this, we can demonstrate this, they do that. They make a wild, it can be a minor, it can be a fairly major improvement in a patient interaction with a service or a clinician's interaction with a service or a part of the clinician's workflow or anything like that. And that is really valuable. It's in a service that does lack incentives for innovation, is fragmented, is short-termist, and there is a lack of trust in tech. Finding these great opportunities to innovate these tiny interactions is a good thing. But what there's less of is, great, you've improved that tiny portion of the patient journey. How well is the patient journey working generally? And that's the kind of, patient journeys are not ready to be digitized because, as this article says, improving the way each patient journey is managed is essential to ensure appropriate care. Patients don't often have access to their own health data. Records are rarely compatible to be shared either externally or within different healthcare units within the NHS, GP, surgeries, hospitals, specialist clinics. A platform that's interoperable, that contains all patient data, harmonised to support transfers in between healthcare providers is crucial. But that's testament to, I guess, a wider issue, which is you need to close all of those little gaps because none of them have been digitized. So each little innovation is closing that gap to build that infrastructure, but it's still piecemeal. It's still very incremental. I think, for me at least, the big takeaway is how do we change that journey? It's portions of the patient journey are being digitized. The whole journey's not ready yet. So do we do that piecemeal, incremental, or are we going to end up with the same challenges across the road? Obviously, we can't start from scratch, but yeah, I think there is a question.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because it would be wonderful if we were in a position to just say, let's look at it, let's just invest all the money, and then let's just make a perfect A to Z digital pathway. Like, that would be amazing. But realistically, it's just not going to happen. So this piecemeal approach, it's that way because that's the way it's got to be. It's the only way we can move forward is to start to innovate in those sections. So that wider piece is almost, it feels like the holy grail that you'd love to go to, but we can't. So do we instead try to innovate in these sections and then link between them? Or do we do the innovation in those sections and then once we have most of it digitized, can we do an overarching piece where we sort of think, well, at least everything's in a digital format at this point. So we're closer to being able to do that wider piece than we are now because it's just impossible. It feels like a project management question. How do we do this? Like, in an interview, give me the way that you would innovate the digital health pathway for NHS patients. And that interoperability thing is just the massive challenge. And I don't necessarily think that patients having access to their own data is the challenge here. It would be nice, but the real challenge is it going from one NHS surgery to then you get recommend or referred to someone else that needs it in a different format who carries out certain tests. How do we link it all back? I'd love to know all of that stuff behind the scenes, but ultimately I, as a patient, don't need to. What I need to know is that my GP is going to know all that stuff and there's not going to be anything that drops out or is made harder at any point along the way. And I think that's where patients feel let down by it because they'll be told they're going to get referred. Yeah, ultimately, I think where patients feel let down is where they've gone in, they've had this referral, they've had the blood tests or whatever, and then they don't hear back. And then they go into their GP and maybe that has been logged, maybe it hasn't, and they don't know. And that's where you start to feel that it's failing for you. But as a system, we just need to make sure that doctors get what they need at every step along the way. It's a tricky one, interoperability. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I feel like what we're doing by approaching these small problems is the best way to allow people to innovate because it allows people to hone in on something and be like, this is a real problem and here is the solution. And that is so much easier to then sell in to a health provider at large saying, we are fixing this for you and this is where you will see the value, that is so much easier to sell in than it is to say, we're going to revolutionize your pathway. And they're like, well, it's too much work. I'm already working at 150% on my salary from 3 years ago, to your point earlier, Huw. So when people feel like they're already doing too much, that larger piece of work just feels like one piece too far. But if you are just saying, we're solving this for you, that's where you get buy-in from the actual people it will affect. And that's where we start to affect change, I think. So it feels like, yes, it's fragmented, but it feels like it's sort of the way it's got to be done right now, is where I'm landing on it.
And I guess that brings us to the national leadership, local delivery piece, where you can solve at the local level with those incremental changes. Ultimately, and I know there are people at the national level, who are looking at that individual patient journeys and looking at it from like, what could we do? What could it be, and how hard is it going to be to implement? How hard is it to build services that are, that actually transform the journey rather than fixing the broken bits of the current ones.
Also, on a local level, problems can be really different, because sometimes that access piece is due to living 15 miles away from your nearest hospital. And sometimes it's because you actually live in a city and it's just too busy. Like at kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, you might be 2 minutes or an hour away from where you need to be. The problems are very different, but ultimately the end result, which is that the patient doesn't get the help that they need to, is the same. So that's why it really makes sense to look at these at local levels, I think, because otherwise, how can you solve for those very unique problems that individual people have?
Well, I think we've just come up with the ultimate NHS England interview task for project managers, as you said.
Yeah, exactly.
Pigeon will be getting our moving to an agile delivery model soon. Me and Belle are going to have 10-minute stand-ups at the start and end of every day. But I think we'll nail it. I think we'll solve it. Give us a couple of years. Our next story comes to us from Med City News, and it's titled 4 Things Digital Health Investors Need to Get Off Their Chest. So rather than being confessions of a slightly ominous kind, they are actually talking about digital health, which is good. But a very brief rundown of a conference in which a number of investors attended a panel. We've got 4 potentially, I don't know, some of them might grind people's gears, some of them might be very welcome, but let's run through them. So the first, and I think this is going to be, particularly if you're a founder, the most controversial, it's not a bad thing that the digital health investment market has cooled off. We'll come back to each one as we go. But the next one is investors are much more than money machines. They help startups create... They help startups create the network they need for commercialization. Next one, a lot of AI startups seem like they're products rather than companies. And finally, diversity really does matter, and there are ways to take actionable steps towards a more inclusive industry. So, I think there's a lot in here that we can break down. Some might take a bit longer, some might not. So I'm going to go straight to the things that I think we can get through very quickly, which is investors are much more than money machines. They help startups create the network they need for commercialization. Now, we know some amazing investors. We know fantastic people working at the seed stage, the angel stage, right through to VCs in Series A, Series B, Series C. I don't think any of us would say that investors are not, on the whole, there are obviously bad examples, don't provide value to the startups. They absolutely do. There are countless examples of companies that simply wouldn't have made it without steering of really high quality investors at every level. And I think a lot of VC-backed startups owe a lot of their growth to the contributions of the investors who help them, who help build those networks, who sit on their board and help steer them, who have that experience, whether they're former operators themselves or whether they, have kind of are active in wider networks. That said, I don't think that's really necessarily a confession. I think that's almost the sales pitch of investors generally. I think most founders, no matter whether they're talking to the best investors or, Joe Bloggs in their angel round who probably, is there for the check, that's probably the same line each investor will give in that. So I wouldn't say this is a big confession. If you have something if you are a digital health investor and you have something to get off your chest, feel free to DM me on LinkedIn. We can get you on the next one.
People saying, but Huw, I am just a money machine. What do you mean?
Yeah, if anyone does want to say we're just money machines, come and talk to us. That'd be great.
But no, with this one, just super quickly, I know you're trying to chip through it really, really fast. But yeah, I think especially at like early stage, especially seed stage, Series A, the investors you choose are just absolutely critical to your journey. And any good startup founder knows that. They know that they're picking investors for what they can offer you as a business in terms of advice, in terms of network, in terms of connections, to the same, that's just as valuable, if not more valuable than the money. It's just like Dragon's Den as well. They go in with, I want this investor because you're the one that has connections into that chain of Boots and I'm a drugstore product or whatever it is. They know the value of what those individuals offer rather than just the money. Otherwise, they'd all just be taking the first offer. I don't even watch Dragon's Den, but I think that's the premise. Let's make a digital health version. But yes, no, I think it's just critical. And everyone knows that, really. It doesn't feel like you say, like confession.
Completely. I'm going to go on to the next one, which is diversity really does matter. And there are ways to take actionable steps towards a more inclusive industry. I really hope that there's no one out there that disagrees with this, despite the fact that we all know there are. This should be fairly uncontroversial statement. It's welcome to see investors pushing this. It's really important, particularly after we've seen notable examples over recent months of some very high-profile VCs clearly taking a very contrasting view to the one expressed here. The article takes the specific investor talking about it. That, for instance, Black founded startups received just 0.5% of the $140.4 billion raised by all US startups last year, and research shows that female founders raise only 2% of venture capital dollars annually. And yet, completely on the flip side, we see so much positive research about the value of having a diverse team, the value of having diverse founders. It's both on the financial, it's the growth, it's the company culture. Across the board, there are benefits, and we should not still be arguing about this. If we are, this is exactly why we need to keep pushing these buttons and pushing these points, because it's so important. Hopefully not too controversial. If you do want to come and disagree with us on Healthtech Pigeon about that and you're an investor, we probably won't say yes.
I was going to say... Not an episode anyone's going to be volunteering to speak on anytime soon. On that, I just wanted to very quickly say something that was, I thought, really nice in this article on this is this actionable step that they've made an example of, which is that this investor has said that in all of the term sheets that her firm signs, she has a clause that stipulates that the company's makeup needs to reflect the population you're headquartered in. So if you're based in South America, your company needs to look like the people around you or wherever, which I think is just a lovely way. It's not saying you need to hire X number of people. It's just saying you need to look like the people you're trying to serve, because otherwise, how can you really kind of know of their problems and how to solve them? I think it's just a really lovely way of doing it. It feels really actionable, but it feels like no one could get offended by that. How could they? It just feels like common sense. And I just thought that was a really, really lovely action here.
It's a rational expectation that can help drive change. Obviously, loads of other ways that it can drive change. And VC itself has some... has its own challenges, has its own, gender balance, ethnic balance to make up and, to address at its sort of entry and its senior levels as well. So I don't think, we're not going to let VC off the hook on this one, but it's so positive that we're talking about this. Slightly annoying that we have to. But yeah.
0.5% is really bleak.
It's outrageous, isn't it?
It's just outrageous. That's the only word.
The third point we're going to go through on this one, and I think this is for me, probably the most controversial. It's not a bad thing that the digital health investment market has cooled off. So obviously 2020 and 2021 and early 2022 were quite unique in that it was basically a big free-for-all. Untested, unproven companies were getting lots of money thrown at them in the health tech space. And that was simply unsustainable. That said, we are now looking at the lowest level of investment. I think the most recent stats were the lowest level of actual capital spent on digital health since 2018. So the argument that put forward by Sean Ellis, managing partner at Distributed Ventures, is that founders were willing to come to the market and take a reset in terms. I think where we are now, the market is sort of digesting. I think people are still pouring capital. There's money to be had. But I'm seeing founders more disciplined with what they're building, paying more attention to unit economics, contribution margin, thinking critically about the milestones in their business and KPIs they need to show along the way. What he's essentially saying is that, and I think he does actually say this in a quote somewhere in this article, that some of the founders receiving money in, I guess, the boom, the digital health boom around the COVID pandemic didn't really deserve it. Deserve is a strong word there. But yeah, I'm interested. Belle, what do you think? I mean, yeah, is it, I'm not going to force you to say, is it a good thing? But do we need to be a bit more, like, if you're a founder, stuff like this is quite challenging to look at. It is becoming a lot harder than it was a couple of years ago. If you're a VC, it's like, well, obviously we don't, we're not seeing the return. We've seen a lot of high profile failures.
Yeah.
Is digital, is it a good thing?
I'm not going to ask you that question directly, but here you go.
Yeah.
No, I do have a view on this. And I went to a webinar recently, it was about biotech investment trends, but there were two investors on that call, and they were saying that much the same thing, which is that biotech actually is seeing a bit of a rise over the last year, which is nice, but overall, they're seeing the same thing, which is that investors are being a bit more savvy about who and what they're investing in, which means that it is then left to founders to really, really demonstrate impact at the early stage to get investors on board, to really show that this is a problem that we can solve, and here's a problem that doesn't really have any other alternative solutions. This is a problem that will save money. And this is how we're demonstrating specifically clinical impact with biotech, but obviously digital health would be that as well. But what I think is good here is that it is forcing people to take a more mature view of how they're going to grow a business and a product, and actually say, here are demonstrable timelines on which we're going to do that. And this is how we are going to showcase that clinical results. What they specifically said is they were particularly like looking at investing in companies that had some clinical results already, like proof of concept stage, so that they could then fund in order to get them to that proper clinical trial, or a very, very kind of clear roadmap in order to do that, which just makes loads of sense. But what they also said, which I thought was interesting, is while investors are being more picky, they're seeing the rounds raised tend to be a bit bigger, because they are having to get you right to that clinical marker and beyond it. 'Cause you've got to get to clinical trial, and then you've got to do something with that clinical trial data. So while it might be harder to get that investment, especially for the founders who are having to really, really push hard for these kind of clinical results early on, you're able to get bigger rounds, you're able to get better investors on board who, much to the point earlier, can demonstrate all the other benefits as well as just the money. They can connect you with the people you need to reach those milestones along the way. So I do think it is a good thing. I don't think it's ever good that we're just chucking money at things that turn out to be a bit shit. You just have to look at like some of the contracts over the past few years, and you're like, how has no one gone to jail for that yet? In lots of the cases, but at the worst, like far less than that is just, how did someone get money for something which was clearly always going to be a failure or a bit of a bust? So I think it's a good thing. I want to see the whole digital health market. I want to see it raise itself up. I want to see good products get to the end line. And I think we can only do that if people are a little bit pickier. And if the founders getting the money are the people who you can tell have put the thought in to reach that end goal, not just, I like the idea of founding a startup. This feels like a problem, growth, growth, growth. And that's something which a lot of people have fallen victim to over the past few years. And you see this massive growth. And even if that company is still around, we've seen so many layoffs and things as well. And that's due to misplaced business development plans. That's due to injections of funding that they think supports a ×5 team growth size, when actually would that money have been better spent getting you through clinical and regulatory hurdles? Probably. So I think, yes, to answer the question, I think, yes, it is a good thing, probably. But I'd like to see that this is a baseline to then inject a bit more energy into the market. So we see more money start to flow, but we hold ourselves accountable for ensuring that they flow into good places and good businesses.
So my only comment straight off the back of it is that I think, if we take everything you just said and reduce it down to its most basic, almost too basic way, what this means is that we'll get good startups with real evidence accelerated faster with more money, and it'll be a really good thing in the end because you'll have the proven things going forward. What I wonder, though, is how we get companies to that point. That's the only thing that worries me on the digital health funding piece, which is, if VCs are, more keen to keep their, bigger raises on higher quality stuff, you've got to get the company from, we've got an idea, to we've got the evidence that actually generates the Series A or the really good, or even the seed. So I think the value of the angels, the value of the, I guess, even the research teams within academia before they spin out, who have this opportunity to pull this together, and the backing of universities to push this research, to push this data, get this evidence before your big time investors even need to look at it, is going to become more and more important. The people who can just write a check at a level and accept probably a higher level, it's less money, but personally a higher level of risk.
Yeah. I think it makes this early stage riskier, doesn't it? Because you're just like, you just need to basically scatter some money around and just hope that some of them show that impact. I think we'll also see, in addition to those like value of investors that you mentioned before, and I think university spin-outs is key actually, but the value of things such as the NHS Innovation Accelerator and things like that, like these structured programs to get people some of that pilot data that starts to demonstrate that, I think will be really, really vital. And great that we're seeing so much appetite for things like that. I think the NHS Innovation Accelerator has been a really successful thing that we're seeing, and more of that can only be a good thing with larger support, a cohort of people who are all in it together, and really trying to demonstrate that impact early. But yeah, it's risky. I wouldn't want to do it.
On to our last confession from VCs from this article. A lot of AI startups, let's be quiet on this one, seem like they might be products rather than companies. And this is Nancy Sullivan, who, when she comes across a healthcare AI startup, asks herself one question: is this a product or a company? Which, I assume she asks other questions as well. But she gives an example, the drug discovery process. We've seen a lot of AI-enabled drug discovery, and I think we do see a lot of AI-enabled drug discovery hitting the news, so we're not alone on that one. And I think that helps, but I don't know if that's standalone. And I think it's a good question. Obviously, AI is all the rage, and AI startups that describe themselves as AI startups are taking a significant chunk of the venture funding that is out there. So, do we think that she's got a point?
Yes, and no. I know that we've heard from lots of investors and startups that do work with AI that there has been sort of a general sort of oversaturation of the term AI, to the extent that businesses that very much do have a real AI element as a core part of its businesses are finding themselves sort of damping down on that because they don't want investors to think that they're leaning into the hype when actually they've got, 5 years of experience working on very much an AI company. I think there's been just this general like, oh, not the term AI again. And so often it's a case of, like you say, this add-on, it's a chatbot that just happens to complement your product. That's not an AI company. And there are very much real AI drug discovery companies, such as your example there. But it's when it's a case of we're solving this through lab-based biological work. Oh, and by the way, AI helps us crunch some data. That feels less like, well, what is the impact of AI on your business here? It just feels like something which I could tick a box and decide to include or not, rather than you are someone who's done all the work, who's developed these massive data sets, who's developed these neural networks, these algorithms that form really, really unique insights. And AI is literally transformative and can do great things. But so often it's being like, oh, it's AI this. And you're like, no, that's just an automation. Or, I mean, is it AI or is it a macro in Excel? Probably not. But I think there is this conflation of automation and AI. And we need to just be sure that, and by the way, none is bad. Automation also has its place, but let's just call it what it is rather than trying to shoehorn in these hypey words and then people ultimately feeling let down when they realize that just means they're using a form of ChatGPT at the end of their chat service. So yeah, I think AI, the confession, AI startups feel like products than companies often, is definitely the case, but I feel like we'd all do better if we just called things what they were. I'd love to hear more companies talking about the fact that they are a computational biology company, that they're an automation company, that they're data driven. You can be data driven without using AI, and that's really valuable and really impactful across much of the healthcare ecosystem. So let's just call things what they are so that, one, you can talk about it properly and defend yourself and it doesn't feel like you're just saying words for the hell of it. And then people say, well, what's your AI built on? And you've not got an answer. Yeah, I think we can all do better. And I'd love to see that the companies who are really using AI in impactful ways, I'd love to see them celebrated for that rather than sort of lost in the general miasma of AI buzzwords and hype at the moment.
Why would you not use AI when you're data driven? Like, I just don't see the point.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and it must be interesting for investors that have been investing in AI for a long time, and so are the go-to people for investment in this space. They must have just be getting an influx of people, and it must be, they know exactly what they're looking for, so they're able to quite clearly cut through, the chaff. Is that phrase? Cut through the chaff. But for people that aren't working specifically in that space, that are maybe more generalist tech investors or more generalist health investors, to suddenly have loads of AI stuff thrown at them, it's a harder distinction to make. And you shouldn't have to be trawling through and be like, is this exactly true? Or is it a half truth? Or is it an outright lie? I hope that's never the case, but it certainly is. So it would just mean that everyone can invest in things more transparently, I think.
Yeah, so I fully agree with pretty much everything you're saying. I think, again, we talk about AI a lot on this podcast, and I think it's going to depend on where we are in the hype cycle, isn't it? I think no one's quite sure where we are. Generative AI in particular is going to be the thing that everyone's adding to their deck right now, or will have been adding to their deck for the last year, and it's something that investors do seem to care about. Like, you look at the stats for where the money's going, and AI startups are taking, self-described AI startups are taking a shocking amount of the money. But we'll leave you with the final piece of advice from George Khalifa, Vice President of the Midwest at the Toronto Stock Exchange. New one for Pigeon, I think. If AI is your central story and it's really impactful to your theme, stick with it and be consistent, because it's just like money comes in quick, money also washes out. So, a year from now, we could see people frantically removing the words AI and generative AI from their decks because no one wants it anymore. It's unlikely, let's be fair, but
just takes a big data leak and then people are scrambling and frantic.
Exactly. There we have it. 4 big pieces of advice, confessions, and various things investors want you to know. So we'll leave it there, I think. You can read all of the stories that we've talked about today, all 2, and loads of others in the Healthtech Pigeon newsletter, along with some of the best jobs, podcasts, and events in health tech, all at healthtechpigeon.com. Thank you, Belle, for joining me today. Thank you, producer Adama, who remains stoically quiet. We'll see everyone else next week.